Welcome to the first in 4 videos that walks through an AQA GCSE paper on the Normans. This video will focus on question 1, the interpretations question. This is the question we will examine: how convincing is interpretation A about English village life after the Norman conquest? Explain your answer based on your contextual knowledge and what it says in interpretation A. Note the parts of the question in italics will always be the same, it is just the topic of the interpretation that differs. This is a how convincing question. In other words, how does this interpretation match your understanding of the given topic? It specifically asks you to refer to what it says in the interpretation rather than on the provenance. It is also important to highlight the topic, as the interpretation may discuss other topics. Also, in this case, the question asks you to look at village life. It is also important to highlight the phrase your contextual knowledge. In other words, you need to go beyond the interpretation to things you have learnt about the topic. Think about the interpretation like a springboard that you use as a starting point to show off your own knowledge and understanding of the topic. I will now give you 1 minute to read what it says in the interpretation and highlight important features on village life. Be careful, as there are some red herrings in this interpretation, where the author discusses other topics, such as the feudal system. I have highlighted the phrase communal fields divided into strips and labeled this with the key term continuity. This is because peasant farmers still used the same techniques as they used during Saxon times, and the manor was still portioned out into strips, which allowed for equality and fairness. I have also highlighted the phrase forest law was hated by many peasants. This is an easy phrase to use as a springboard, because you can discuss the impact of the forest laws on village life, as the peasants could no longer use the forest to forage and hunt. If they did, then they'd face terrible punishments, including castration, if caught hunting deer. I have then highlighted 2 phrases in a different color. These are phrases I can challenge in some way. Firstly, the phrase neither the Normans nor the English starved is true for those living in villages in the south of England. But following the 1069 harrying of the north, there was widespread starvation across Yorkshire after the Norman army burnt the crops and salted the land. Furthermore, whilst it is true that the English lords were replaced by Norman lords, the role of the reeve did not change. This was the manager of the peasants in the fields, and he remained Saxon. This meant for many peasants, they would not have felt much difference in the way their village was organized and run. Let's now examine a model answer. My first paragraph starts by saying the following: interpretation A is mostly convincing, because village life remained largely the same for peasants. Interpretation A states that William did not greatly change the strip field system apart from replacing English lords and Norman lords. This is convincing, because most continued to use the rotation of crops to produce wheat, oats or barley. This paragraph begins by agreeing with the interpretation, but also going beyond the interpretation, by including own knowledge about the type of crops that were grown by the peasants. The paragraph continues by challenging the interpretation. It reads, "Furthermore, Whilst the lord of the manor was Norman, the reeve that managed the peasants was Saxon, so more likely to be fair. The only part of England that this interpretation does not consider is Yorkshire, where the harrying of the north meant that many peasants starved due to the salting of the crops. Therefore, the interpretation cannot be considered fully convincing. This second half of the paragraph challenges the interpretation by arguing that village life did not continue the same for all areas of England. Note the use of an embedded quote, the word starved, to directly challenge the author's interpretation. You can do this, but if you do, make sure you justify it with evidence. Let's now examine the second paragraph. It reads, furthermore, interpretation A is convincing, because it discusses William's merciless attitude to the peasants. It's true that most peasants hated the forest laws, because they relied on the forest to supplement their diet with foraged or hunted food. At the start of this paragraph, I have once again used a quote from the interpretation, and used it as a springboard for my own knowledge. This is easy enough to do, if you have revised thoroughly, so have a wealth of knowledge to pull from. The paragraph continues by challenging the interpretation. Whether or not the Norman lord demanded more work from the peasants would vary from manor to manor, according to the lord's character. Peasants already worked from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week, so they could not work any longer hours since Sunday was the Sabbath, or holy day of rest. Therefore it would really depend on how much tax each lord demanded as to whether or not the peasants resented Norman rule, making the interpretation mostly convincing. I have then gone on to challenge the notion that the lord demanded more work from peasants, as this is something of a sweeping statement. I have used this as a springboard to discuss my own knowledge of a peasant's working schedule, and to include a mention of the Sabbath day of Sunday, since this was such a fundamental part of village life. In this sense, I am showing range of knowledge, and also showing judgment about the interpretation. I then finish the paragraph with a short judgment. This saves time, because if that judgment corresponds with what I have said elsewhere in the answer, then I do not need to write a separate conclusion. Put together, the full answer looks like this. You need to aim to write 2 paragraphs about 2 aspects of the interpretation. Focus on elements that are relevant to the question, in this case, on village life. Then ensure that you go beyond what it says in the interpretation. Use it as a springboard for your own knowledge. Thank you for watching. Tune into the next lecture in this series to learn how to answer the 8-mark importance question for the Normans unit.